to 9/11 was welcome to the club. We've been through this, and you haven't done it to us. So, for example, I've forgotten whether I quoted it in there, but the research journal of the Jesuit University in Managua, Nicaragua, which is one of the main research journals in Central America, they published an editorial immediately after 9/11 describing it, as everyone did, as a horrifying atrocity, expressing sympathy for the victims, saying you could call it Armageddon. And then they added, but we have been through our own Armageddon in slow motion under massive terrorist attack organized and directed by the United States, which led to tens of thousands of people killed and the country practically ruined and may never recover. So we do sympathize with the terrible atrocity that was carried out against you, but it's not unfamiliar to us. And that was a reaction through a good deal of the world. That's why if you look at there was an international Gallup poll taken shortly after September 11th. I think it was about September 20th, or roughly in that, about a week after, asking, this was at a time when the bombing of Afghanistan had in effect been announced, but it had not yet been undertaken, so it was in that interim period. And the question asked around the world was, do you support, if what it said actually is, if the perpetrators of the terrorist attack are identified on that assumption, would you be in favor of bombing the place where they came from, their refuge? And then there were two questions. If it attacked only military targets, second, if it also hit civilians. Well, it was never published in the United States, but the responses were interesting. There was very little support for the policy that was actually undertaken. And incidentally, we should say that they hadn't identified the perpetrators. But in Latin America, which is the region of most experience with U.S. domination and intervention, the support was extremely low. It ranged from about 2% in support in Mexico to about 11%, I think, in Colombia and Venezuela. The only marginal exception was Panama, which has a very Anglo an American component there, and even there 16% supported bombing. I think 80% supported diplomatic means for efforts for extradition, and that reflects a history of experience, long experience. So yes, all over the world there was overwhelming sympathy for the victims, horror of the terrible atrocity, but a recognition that life's more complicated. We've been on the receiving end for a long time from European imperialism, which was violent and destructive, and from the U.S. variant of it. And I think it's only first of all, it's the merest honesty to face this. But if we're interested in reducing the threat of terrorism, which is enormous, if you want to really be frightened, read the recent Hart-Rudman sponsored study of the Council on Foreign Relations on terrorist threats to the United States, and they're pretty awesome. Well, if you hope to reduce and lessen these threats, you have to make a crucial distinction between the terrorists themselves, who are carrying out criminal acts, and you treat it like criminal acts, and the reservoir of in which their message kind of resonates, even among people who hate and despise them, but nevertheless recognize some authenticity to what they say. And it's that reservoir of, you can't really call it sympathy, but understanding, where real grievances lie that have to be dealt with. That's true no matter what kind of terrorism you're facing. If you want to reduce the threat, pay attention to the grievances from which they arise, and if they're legitimate, and they often are, deal with them, for one thing, because they're legitimate. for another because it's just sanity if you're hoping to reduce the terror. These are topics discussed in the book. In interviews.
Just tuned in. Noam Chomsky is our guest, and we're going to go to the phones. We have a call from Maryville, Illinois. First up, go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I was introduced to your writings and works as an undergraduate about 4 years ago at the University of Illinois, and I was intrigued by your, by the straightforwardness that you had in your writings, and I first read them on ZNet. And anyway, my question, it's a two-part question. They're unrelated parts. My first question is, where do you attribute the incompetence of today's leaders in this country as compared to, the leaders such as FDR and, in the early 20th century, men of distinction and honor? I know, presidents like Andrew Jackson and some other ones were, not very honorable, but where do you attribute this? I mean, it's been decades now where we've had leaders, one after the other, just promote these policies and enact these these wars and these where do you attribute that to?
Thanks, caller. That's good.
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word incompetence. I mean, I think they're very competent. They know what they're doing. They're dedicated, committed. They even tell us very frankly what they're doing. So, for example, the national security strategy that was announced last September was a very clear, brazen statement of a program of sustaining world dominance by means of force and announcing the intention to rely on force to suppress any potential challenge to that dominance. Now, that's quite a departure as a policy statement, and it sent many shudders around the world, including the foreign policy elite at home. But there's nothing incompetent about it. It's a very clear, explicit statement, frank statement. Why they're pursuing those policies, well, we can look at them. But if we take an honest look at the past, it's not very pretty. I mean, we can ask, for example, why we're sitting where we're sitting. There were people here, after all, lots of them, millions of them. What happened to them? Well, the founding fathers were pretty frank about it. They knew what they were doing. John Quincy Adams, for example, many years after his own very ugly contributions to this were over, did have a change of heart, and he condemned what they had done in what he called exterminating the hapless race of Native Americans with ferocious cruelty, or words approximately like that. They understood what they were doing. They cleared the continent. They conquered half of Mexico in a war which was bitterly condemned within the country. Correctly, it was a terrible war. A century ago, the United States conquered the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people. That good part of the military command ended up facing war crimes trials afterwards. There was bitter condemnation of that too. Mark Twain, for example, the leading, maybe the leading writer in the United States, wrote very bitter, sardonic anti-war essays, and we can go on. The history has not been a pretty one, and that's why after the national territory was conquered, power extended to the region. The United States was not a major actor in the global scene until after Second World War, but it was regionally the dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America, extending to Hawaii, which was taken from its own citizens by force and guile, onto the Philippines, but particularly in Central America and the Caribbean. Now, those are not, if you take a look at the record there, it's not at all attractive.
Washington, D.C., for Noam Chomsky, good morning.
Good day. Well, there's more like 300,000 in the Philippines, and that's my point and my disagreement with Mr. Chomsky. It's too general, Mr. Chomsky. It has to be specific as a prosecutor and factually, and the facts are known. The body counts are well known, and